Okay. Good evening. I'm Jim Parenti, and I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. And it is my great pleasure, on behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and the University of Minnesota, to welcome you all here this evening to our lecture and celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law. Thanks to the exceptional vision and generosity of Otto and Helen Silha and their commitment to the ethical responsibilities and the legal rights of mass media, we have been very privileged at our university to have an internationally renowned center in the crucially important, indeed increasingly important fields of media ethics and law. In the media, we read and hear almost daily about the imminent demise of newspapers, a circumstance exacerbated by the economic downturn, and lamentations, usually online, about the decline of traditional print media of communication. There is little doubt that the media landscape has changed, but the ethical and legal issues arising from journalism have most certainly not. On the contrary, as our modes of interpersonal and public communication have multiplied in diverse ways, so have the ethical and legal issues surrounding the use of new and emerging media, the rights of and protections for professional journalists, the boundaries between journalistic inquiry and national security or personal privacy, and the ethics surrounding especially sensitive matters such as government surveillance and the horrors of war. In fact, we have a greater need today than ever before for the exceptional work of the Center, for the superb leadership of Professor Jane Kirtley, for the Center's prestigious lecture series, for its training and financial support of graduate and undergraduate students, many of whom have assumed leading positions in the professions as scholars of media law and practitioners, and for its active engagement in the most pressing legal and ethical issues of the moment. During the past 25 years, the Center has emerged as a national and international institution. The Center has submitted amicus briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court and various federal and state appeals courts on issues ranging from the Freedom of Information Act and criminal libel to reporters' privilege and copyright. The Center has also submitted comments to the Council of Europe regarding an initiative to compel a right to reply in the online environment, submitted comments to federal agencies on a wide range of issues, including national security exemptions to the Freedom of Information Act, provided written testimony to Congress on whether journalists who published leaked information should be prosecuted under espionage laws, and provided testimony, written and oral, before the Minnesota Supreme Court on public access to digitized court documents. The Center has also hosted a roster of distinguished lecturers, such as our speaker tonight, and timely public forum, including the annual Spring Ethics Forum and Fall Fora on topics such as the FCC regulation and government surveillance of electronic communications, to the privacy rights of crime victims, the ethics of war reporting, and the ethics of healthcare coverage. The Center has contributed enormously, both intellectually and financially, to the education of scores of graduate and undergraduate students, and is poised to play an even larger role through the newly created dual PhD JD program with the University of Minnesota Law School. University of Minnesota President Robert Brunix is a great admirer of the Silha Center, and though he could not be with us here this evening, he has written a letter to Mrs. Helen Silha that I should like to share with you now about the impact the center has had since its founding 25 years ago. Dear Mrs. Silha, he wrote, I am so pleased to have the occasion on the 25th anniversary of the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law to thank you for the generosity that led you and your late husband, Otto Silha, to establish this important academic center and public resource. The Silha Center's mission is both prescient and timeless. With electronic media transforming the landscape of all our communications and the fate of daily newspapers in question, the Center remains as critical now as it has been throughout its first 25 years. While we cannot predict the shape of future media as a leading research and educational institution, we have a responsibility to make sure that freedom and fairness continue to serve as guiding principles for those working in the journalism and communication fields. The Silha Center attests to the vision and values you and your husband each nurtured through your University of Minnesota educations and embraced in your life together. It is also a wonderful extension of Otto's leadership and dedicated service as a University of Minnesota regent and longtime University of Minnesota Foundation trustee. Your creation of the Silha Center for the Study of Media, Ethics, and Law is a powerful and fitting legacy, and the University of Minnesota is privileged to serve as its home. Sincerely, Robert H. Brunix, President. And now I'd like to officially present a copy of this letter to Mrs. Helen Silha, who is with us here this evening in the front row. And now I should like to introduce to you Professor Jane Kirtley from the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, who will introduce to you our main speaker this evening. Professor Kirtley has been Silha Professor of Media Ethics and Law in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication since August of 1999. Prior to her appointment at Minnesota in May of 2000, she served as the Executive Director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in Arlington, Virginia for 14 years. She also serves as an affiliated faculty member of the University of Minnesota Law School, and she has been the Distinguished Visiting Professor of Law at Suffolk University Law School in Boston, Massachusetts. Professor Kirtley speaks frequently on First Amendment, freedom of information, and media ethics issues, both in the United States and abroad, on all continents, I believe, except Antarctica. Though with global warming and the melting of the Antarctic ice, there will surely be attendant ethical and legal media issues to consider. She is a commentator for the Neiman Watchdog and wrote the First Amendment Watch column for the American Journalism Review from 1995 to 2006. Professor Kirtley has been a practicing attorney and has received many awards and honors, including the Edith Wortman First Amendment Matrix Foundation Award. She's been inducted into Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism's Hall of Achievement. She has into the Freedom of Information Hall of Fame, and she has also been awarded the John Peter Zenger Award for Freedom of the Press and the People's Right to Know from the University of Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kirtley.
Good evening. It's really my privilege and pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Chuck Lewis is an old friend of mine, and we've had many adventures. Some years ago, at my behest, we went together to Minsk in Belarus. A few years later, we went to Dublin in Ireland. I hope you'll think this is the best of the three, Chuck, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chuck has been a national investigative journalist for longer than many of you could even imagine, even though he looks disarmingly young. He left a successful career as an investigative producer for ABC News and for CBS News in their program 60 Minutes. And he's gone on to start a number of nonprofit centers, all dedicated to excellence in investigative journalism. His centers have been honored by many national journalism organizations for their work. It isn't often that you get to introduce a genius, but Chuck is one. That's not my opinion. He was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, which is what's usually referred to as the Genius Award, in 1998. He's also received the Penn USA First Amendment Award for expanding the reach of investigative journalism, for his courage in going after a story regardless of whose toes he steps on, and for boldly exercising his freedom of speech and freedom of press. He's taken on some big businesses and some big governmental interests, both in the United States and abroad. And I think you will find that he is an inspiring speaker who can really explain to you not only the importance of journalism, but if I may say so, the altruistic side of journalism. He's currently the executive editor of the new investigative reporting workshop at American University in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Chuck Lewis.
Wow. Thank you all for coming out on a rainy night. It's a great treat to be here. I want to congratulate Helen Silha and your entire family for what you've created a quarter century ago, and Jane Kirtley for your magnificent stewardship in the last decade. This is a national treasure, this center, and I'm looking forward to the next quarter century. So, gosh, that's quite a crowd here. So I'll yammer around here for a bit, and then we'll do questions, of course, which is always the best part. I'll try not to be too long here. With its First Amendment protections and libel laws, relative transparency, and the physical security accorded to all citizens, the United States should be the world's most hospitable place for investigative reporting. And generally, that is true. It is the world's most hospitable place to do investigative journalism. We have the world's oldest Freedom of Information law. We have the more than 2-century-old First Amendment from our Constitution, and our journalists are not in physical danger as long as they're working inside the 50 states for the most part. Transparency and freedom of speech are absolutely fundamental in any democracy, and it is to this one too. By contrast, the London-based group Article 19 in 2007 found that 158 of 168 countries surveyed have criminal defamation laws. That means not only will they sue you, they'll take away all your assets and put you in prison. 113 countries have special laws offering special protection to the most powerful and privileged figures in public life. Okay, so the United States generally has legal and other advantages that most other countries and their journalists do not have. And before I go on, remember that I said this, because I have made some critical observations here. But this context is useful, what I just said. I do recognize where we stand in the world. I think it's important to note. And when you've been around these places, it's particularly notable. We have been living for more than a year in the worst economic crisis since the Depression. Last spring, the Columbia Journalism Review published the result of a major investigation into 2,000 business stories written between the year 2000 and mid-2007. The finding? That very few, quote, investigative stories confronted directly powerful institutions about basic business practices while those institutions were still powerful, unquote. The major news media has been reluctant to conduct these investigations for years. They have also failed to report on the oversight and accountability functions of government. Investigative reporters who have tried to do it are thwarted by their own timid or cash-strapped employers too often. As a result, the public is not as well informed as it should be, when it should be. The CJR report called Blindness, the Media and the Meltdown also found that the public should be aware, warned, so to speak, that its interests and those of the business press may not be in perfect alignment. The business press exists within Wall Street and corporate subculture and understandably must adopt its idioms and customs, the better to translate them for the rest of us. Still, it relies on these institutions for its stories. Burning a bridge is hard. It is far easier for news bureaucracies to accept ever-narrowing frames of discourse, frames forcefully pushed by industry, even if those frames marginalize and eventually exclude the business press's own great investigative traditions. So there may be advantages to beat coverage by news organizations, and there are, but the disadvantage is a kind of Stockholm syndrome in which reporters and their editors begin to think and talk like the people and institutions they are covering. They become simpatico. See, and for more on this, see not only the economic coverage by the business press, but also, of course, recall the pre-Iraq War obsequious, fawning coverage by most of the Washington press corps. It was, and it remains, outrageous. But actually, that's not what I came here to talk about tonight. But I couldn't resist saying it. I am not impressed, and actually I've never been impressed with the extent to which news organizations expose corporate wrongdoing. It is sporadic and infrequent at best. A few years ago, Felicity Behringer of the New York Times pointed out that more than 250 Pulitzer Prizes in journalism have been awarded since 1978. Business figures prominently in about 10. Another person who's a friend of mine, Florence Graves, who founded Common Cause magazine, who now runs the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis, she did a survey herself and found that of the Pulitzers, 90 Pulitzers given for public service journalism, the highest award, the gold medal, only about a handful involved primarily an investigation of corporate power. And of the 25 Pulitzer Prizes awarded for investigative journalism, in just 2 of them did the reporters focus specifically on situations involving corporations. Even in flush times, the job of systematically and thoroughly covering the government, the corporate sector, and the nonprofit sector would have been a mammoth David takes on Goliath effort. But these are not flush times, as we know, for the news business. I'm going to mention a few things, sort of a personal note. I've had a little bit of experience on some of these levels. In 30 years of investigative journalism at the national level, I have to say that my own experiences have revealed certain unspoken realities about investigative reporting, discouragements and disincentives, shall we say, that often keep the major media's journalistic watchdogs from barking, let alone biting. Back when I worked at ABC News in the 1980s, you'll recall Niagara Falls was the site of the biggest environmental disaster of the 1970s in the U.S., the Love Canal scandal, where there was a toxic waste dump under a field, an elementary school field, and is a big elaborate thing. It was sort of the Rachel Carson moment of the 70s. Well, in 1981 or 82, I was asked by ABC News brass to go up there and look into another matter. The same company that had polluted Love Canal, Occidental Petroleum, had dumped 3 times as much toxic waste as that into right around the area of the drinking water treatment plant. And I had a fellow who was working there, and he had home movies of the orange ground around the drinking water treatment plant. He was dying of cancer. The city of Niagara Falls and the state of New York knew that this was happening, that this stuff was leaching into the drinking water. That sounds like a pretty important story, right? I interviewed 100 people, 5 on camera. ABC, when it aired its documentary, somehow that did not appear on the air. We can talk later about what happened there. I'm not sure what happened. I just know that 19 trips to Niagara Falls went out the window. And I think they went out for the wrong reasons. And I have my own theories, but I haven't investigated the reasons. I just have some hunches, but I probably shouldn't mention them. But there's something weird there, and I'm still mad about it. Sorry. When I was at CBS News producing for Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes, and I've never mentioned any of these things publicly, so this is kind of a weird thing. It's sort of, maybe it's like an AA meeting or something, sort of, I wanted to do a story about all the lawyers the tobacco industry had. They had hired 97 of the most prestigious law firms in America to make sure that anyone suing those companies would not have the best legal talent. It was a deliberate strategy. And we did a report called Tobacco on Trial. But before we started to do the research, the owner of CBS News and Mike Wallace had dinner. Now, the owner of CBS News happened to be a fellow at that time named Larry Tisch. Lawrence Tisch owned Lurillard, one of the major tobacco companies in the U.S., and he was also the principal owner of CBS. And over dinner, he told Mike Wallace, Mike, I don't want you to do this story. I wasn't there. This is what Mike told me. I don't get invited to dinners like that too often. And Mike said, and I have reason to think he was accurate on this, he said, "Go to hell, Larry." And we did the story, and we tried to interview Tisch. He wouldn't be interviewed, and we quoted him on the air that Larry Tisch, Lawrence Tisch, we said Lawrence, Lawrence Tisch, president of CBS and president of Lorillard, declined to comment. And then at the holiday party for the 25th anniversary of 60 Minutes, Mike had to point out to Larry Tisch, this is the guy who just, hey, Larry, I want you to meet somebody. But anyway, that was a moment. And I said, hello. There was some blue language there, and I'm trying to not say that Mike also said. Now, that's a case where, to be fair, CBS did the right thing. I mean, it's disturbing that the owner didn't want 60 Minutes to air that, but at least we did it. And Mike Wallace had sold cigarettes in the 50s, and I also insisted that we have that in because I felt it would be hypocritical for us to talk about tobacco advertising and not mention that fact. So, and Mike was not happy about that, but he got overruled by Don Hewitt. So that's a case where it worked kind of sort of like the way it's supposed to in a newsroom, I think, for the most part. Fast forward, that was in 1988. In 1993, there was an astonishingly important story by Walt Bogdanich, who at this point in his life has won 3 Pulitzer Prizes for investigating business, which I have to say he's the only one in the history of the Pulitzers to win 3 for investigating business. That's quite amazing. Walt at that time had only won 1. He was a producer at ABC News, a show called Day One, and he found, in an investigative story, found that the tobacco companies had knowingly altered the levels of nicotine, knowing it was an addictive thing, and they had tested the levels, knowing exactly how to hook smokers. When he aired that, Philip Morris, the day after it aired, sued ABC News for $10 billion. And the same day, there was a $500,000 documentary about exporting cigarettes around the world by a friend of mine, Marty Kewen, very talented journalist. And ABC killed that documentary. $500,000 just went right out the window. They were not going to broadcast another tobacco thing while they were under siege. Now, as a lawyer, you could say, well, you can't air that. It's no way. You have an attitude now about tobacco, and you probably can't. But it was tragic to watch someone's work for 1 whole year go down the drain. And he, in fact, left television and journalism a few months later. It was a devastating thing. Back to Bogdanich. Walt, what happened? ABC News turned over his sources, names, to Philip Morris, and they settled the case without talking to Walt, the reporter. And Bogdanich was so bitter he had to hire his own lawyer. He didn't trust the ABC News lawyers. That is not uncommon. Increasingly, journalists are not sure they can trust their employers. And there's a long conversation. I could go deeper on that, but I'll stop. And then, of course, the most famous tobacco moment in this country in the last 20 years was when CBS News 60 Minutes was afraid to broadcast the segment by Lowell Bergman, a friend of mine, and it became the movie The Insider. Essentially, CBS was trying to basically be bought by someone, and they were terrified that there would be a lawsuit on the books, and they were certain they would be sued if this ran, and so they censored the story. And then when the Wall Street Journal reported it, they thought maybe it would be okay to run the piece after all. But it was not a shining moment for journalism, and of course the movie was, I recommend you all see that movie. It's a great movie. It's also an Oscar nominee. All right, those are 4 cases right there of tobacco attempts at censorship or related issues around keeping the truth about that subject out. But it's actually even more interesting. The first news organization in the United States of any note, a so-called major media outlet, to report on the health effects of tobacco was Reader's Digest. Now, Reader's Digest is not famous for its muckraking prowess. But in the 1940s, they went after this subject that people were getting sick from smoking. And you might say, why Reader's Digest? Well, it was the only major publication in America that did not accept advertising from anybody, including the tobacco companies. Could that be related? I think maybe it was, yes. And another thing, one last thing on tobacco, Johns Hopkins in 1938 did the first known study that linked smoking to shortening your lifespan. Associated Press moved the story, but it was largely ignored, and a well-known journalist in many circles, George Seldes, was livid that this was not being picked up by the media, and he felt the media was spineless about this. And he started his own publication called In Fact, and he did dozens of investigative stories about tobacco, like for years and years and years. So this is all just one example of one industry and one subject and how it has bedeviled news organizations really for 60-plus years. I myself, as Jane alluded, quit CBS. There was a story that I was working on, and folks tried to take a name out of the script of somebody, and I didn't like it, so I quit. And I broke a 4-year contract, had no savings. I had a mortgage and a family, and I basically walked out. The issue was about a very powerful corporation, and the head of the corporation was a social friend of one of the top CBS very well-known executives. And so there's a very long story to that, but I'll save you. We talk all night just about that. But that was a case where, again, in that case, the network was doing the wrong thing. They were protecting somebody, not even for corporate reasons as much as personal reasons. It was a friendship thing. But you may notice a trend here. Anyway, I started the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, and I started from my house, and then I ran it for 15 years from 1989 through 2004, got it up to a staff of 40 people full-time, 100 journalists in 50 countries, 20 to 25 paid interns a year. We did 300 reports and 14 books, including a bestseller, The Buying of the President in 2004. We did a number of books. And I just am mentioning this because I did 35 news conferences at the National Press Club. 2/3 of them were on C-SPAN. And I noticed that whenever we were investigating companies as opposed to politicians, like if we broke the Lincoln bedroom scandal, which we did about Clinton, that was a big story. If we broke all the Iraq contracts and who got the most, Halliburton, that was a big story. If we were investigating the meatpacking plants or this industry or that industry, the timber industry, or you name it, I didn't have that well-attended a news conference. So certain people, they just couldn't make it that day, I guess, in terms of the coverage. And it started to bother me a little bit. And there were some stories we did where a PR firm, Burstyn Marsteller, regarding an industry we were looking at, actually hired people to go into the news conference and infiltrate it and pretend that they were a reporter. I know this because the guy came up to me later and admitted he had been hired to do that, to try to screw it up during the Q&A. So these are games that people play, but they're irritating, and they're, more importantly, the public doesn't get this information, and it's rather significant, I think. Over the 15 years I was there, we looked at tobacco smuggling around the world. We had journalists, literally 10 journalists on 6 continents, and we found that the major tobacco companies were smuggling their product and avoiding billions of dollars in customs duties, and they were prosecuted by the EU and 3 countries after we put that on the internet. We looked at private military companies, 90 of them around the world, that are involved in arms trafficking and all kinds of small arms violence. 10 million people died in a 10-year period from small arms that are being trafficked. And so we put all that out there. And then we did a thing on the cheating of America where we went and spent 3 years with 12 people digging into IRS tax court. It's a fun place to be, just kidding. But we found the most remarkable, the cases of what we were looking for, the most astonishing cases of tax cheats. And we had 36, and we wintered it down to 12, and then I went and visited these people, which was really fun, I have to say. But in all 3 of those cases, and some others, we were threatened with lawsuits. And the time that I was at the center, I think we had more than a dozen formal threats putting us on notice, which is a sort of a legal term. And, you know, that's supposed to keep you from doing that stuff. It didn't seem to work. But anyway, those folks in those instances did not sue, but sometimes we would have 3 threats from 3 continents on the same story. If you're a little scrappy nonprofit, this would have a way of getting your attention. I think if you were a really big multi-billion-dollar corporation, you would probably notice even. The one that did happen, we were sued by Russian billionaire oligarchs. And I hate when that happens. We did a story in 2000, in August 2nd, to be exact, I guess. I wanted to see why it was that a former defense secretary and member of Congress and chief of staff to a president was hired to be a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar global corporation. On its face, it looked odd, which is what I do. I look for stuff that's odd. I'm just kidding. And so we looked at campaign contributions, lobbying, and federal government contracts. And while Dick Cheney was the head of Halliburton, it had doubled from the preceding 5 years. And we did a report about it. I did an article, an op-ed in the New York Times, and the story moved around the U.S. and outside the U.S. But we had a section in there about the business dealings of Halliburton in Siberia. And they had gotten a $480 million Exim Bank loan. And it's a very long, involved story, but suffice it to say that this was a mysterious company that there had been hundreds of stories alleging that around the world, including the U.S., that there were alleged organized crime ties. We had our own reporting from inside the Duma, inside Moscow, and also from inside CIA and inside a major corporation that had done due diligence that all said the same thing. And we had sources in addition. And we went to the company, of course, for comment. And we published it. It was just an anecdote in this larger story that I was talking about earlier. We were asked by a very big Washington law firm, Aiken Gump, to take it off off of the website. We said, no, thank you. And they sued us in U.S. District Court in Washington. It was the first time billionaire Russian oligarchs had ever brought a libel lawsuit against a U.S. media-related publication. And this went on for 5 years of discovery, 250 to 300,000 pages of discovery, thousands of emails given up, 20 people deposed on videotape. They did with me for 2 full days. It was not enjoyable. But anyway, the good news is it was dismissed. But they found out who one of the sources was, and they tried to squeeze him. They threatened to sue him personally. This is a guy who was in failing health, who was a retired intelligence official. And they hired a journalism associate dean and paid him $500,000 to do an affidavit about our techniques. This was his 10th case. He had testified against journalists. He was making more money as an expert witness, I think, than as an associate dean, although I'm sure they're very highly paid. Sorry. But anyway, this was not a fun thing. Now, the reason it was significant is we had some other even stranger, we had 2 other very strange lawsuits that came not from Russians inside the U.S. They were all dismissed, but the Center for Public Integrity lost its libel insurance. And that's not a small issue. So the defense of that Russian case cost the insurer roughly $4 million. The Russians, we don't exactly know what they spent, but Aiken Gump always had 2 or 3 lawyers there for our one lawyer. This was like David and Goliath. It's like a classic biblical tale here. We think it was 8 to 10 million. We don't really know, but it was a lot of money. And so we had a situation. How do we solve this problem? The best accountants, the best lawyers in the United States, and they weren't not cheap, said that the best thing to do would be to break up the center into little bitty pieces and make little LLCs and make it hard for them to go after us because they wouldn't know which part was which. One of our, thank God, one of our lawyers on the advisory board said, "Are you out of your mind?" And we created a 509(a)(3) legal defense endowment group, corporation called the Fund for Independence in Journalism, and I raised $5 million, and we got 5 pro bono law firms, blue chip, prestigious firms, to pledge in writing to defend the center in the future. And we created essentially the equivalent of a self-insurance mechanism for the center. There's been no new cases in 7 years, and as I mentioned, they were all dismissed. Now, to me, that is a triumph of not being buried by extremely powerful people. But it is something with the new ecosystem, which I'll talk about in a second. You know, what do we do about lawsuits? These are serious problems for serious journalism. If it's going to be done, you've got to have a way to handle that, and it's an important thing. And I've run into this problem still with companies. Coming back to the company theme, I run the investigative reporting workshop at American University, and I have a staff of roughly 10 people. And I'm only in my beginning of my second year running it. And we put all the bank data for every bank in the United States, 8,000 of them, up on FDIC end of year 07, 08 data with a troubled asset ratio analysis that bankers use. And the well-known newspaper that we were going to partner with, the editor couldn't sleep at night, was afraid there'd be a run on the banks, and the bankers asked us not to do it. And we did it with MSNBC.com, and there were 3.8 million unique visitors, and we went ahead, and is my point. We were not deterred by the reluctance of a major newsroom. We knew there would not be a run on the banks, and there was not a run on the banks. But we did another story about the conflicts of interest of the former head of Medicare under Clinton, who's now in the Obama White House, who had aligned herself with 10 companies that had been fined $560 million for fraudulent billing or their products allegedly killing people. And we thought that was an important story. And 3 news organizations were talked out of it by the White House. And we posted it. We went back to MSNBC.com and posted that one. We have 6 or 8 other stories coming down the pike. Not all of them are about companies or about that. That was really more of a case of an individual public servant type and the appearance issues. But this kind of work is hard. It's also important, but I'm trying to point out, because we're supposed to talk about media and the law, that these law issues are kind of interesting, to put it mildly. And for people that stare into the abyss doing this kind of journalism, there's very high stakes. What's exciting and what is the good news here, because we haven't talked about what's happening with journalism, and I'm sure in the question and answer we'll come to that, but obviously there have been 200,000 media workers have lost their jobs since 2000. This is one of the most devastating historic transformations in U.S. history of journalism, the media sector, the news sector, and as you all know. And what the good news is that there's a new ecosystem forming of nonprofit investigative reporting organizations. When I started the center in 1989, it was the second one in the United States. Today, there's more than 20 of these, and 10 of them started in the last 3 years. And just in the last week, about 5 more have cropped up. So I'm pleased and honored to be part of the steering committee of the new Investigative News Network with Joel Kramer, who runs one of the most impressive and most respected organizations in the country for these new online ventures, MinPost, which began in 2007. And now we have an investigative news network that will be a group that will stitch together all these heroic, well-meaning, well-staffed, with varying levels of resources and experience groups. And today there's 20 of these organizations that are part of it. I think in 3, 4, 5 months we'll have 40 or 50 new nonprofits that are joining up. And so there is a way to stand tall and to be tough and to tough these things out and to move forward from them and to keep doing this kind of work. But as I'm sort of trying to emphasize, it's not easy, and it's much easier to do daily journalism. What can I mean? I think it's great, by the way. I like balloons; they're fun. I'm just kidding. No, I'm joking. Daily journalism is essential, and I don't mean to. I couldn't resist. So, but you know, this kind of work is different. I mean, this takes some sort of I don't know what you'd call it. Yes, or it's all social dysfunction, maybe. When I had 70 of the best investigative reporters on planet Earth in a room for the first time in 1998, I looked out at them and this is a cliche in journalism, but I didn't know it at the time. I said that B.B. King has that song, "Nobody loves you but your mother, and she could be jiving you too." And I said to all these are people that have been shot at, they've been blown up, they've had siblings murdered for bombs that were intended for them, which I'm happy to talk more about. These journalists around the world that we work with, have worked with, are astonishing with their courage. And there's nothing more exciting than to be around people like that. And I'm complaining about the threat of litigation here. These people are, one guy I know is holed up in a hotel in Bangkok. His family has been in jeopardy now for 6 months, and the Committee to Protect Journalists is trying to get him out of there, even out of Bangkok. They're afraid he'll be found. He's been investigating corruption by the president of his country. I'm talking about Sri Lanka in this case. So when you're around that, it puts all this in perspective. To me, it does. And it's very, very exciting. So I will close with a quote that I use way too much, but I can't resist. From Abraham Lincoln, "I'm a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts." Thank you very much, and happy to take questions.
Okay, so Chuck loves questions, don't you? And we have microphones. 2 people in the back of the room with microphones. So we ask, so that we can get your question for the recording, that you wait for the mic before you ask your question. And so that as many people as possible can ask questions, we ask you to keep your questions fairly brief and concise. So who would like to begin? I'll let you pick them.
Oh, all right.
I'm not going to stay up here with you.
Oh, all right. You're welcome to. You're welcome. You can take these questions. You would do a much better job.
I'm just kind of curious. Here I am.
Oh, sorry.
It's not God speaking to you.
I was like, I was looking up there. Yeah.
Although I sometimes think that. In terms of defenses, you have an entity that is threatening to sue you if you expose them. What do the laws of that prevent coercion? Can those be used for your defense? And if indeed their threat of lawsuit is totally baseless, can't you countersue them for like frivolous litigation?
It's a great question. With us, I mean, my experience is the threats usually occur right before publication, like literally, like within 48 hours or 5 days before, depending on the situation. You don't usually. Yeah, that's usually when they surface. I mean, and that was particularly true at 60 Minutes. We would be airing on Sunday. We'd have lawyer conference calls threatening us on Thursday or Friday.
Can they threaten you? I mean, isn't that illegal?
Yeah, they can threaten us. We once had a law firm for one story. They had 2 different law firms, one in Los Angeles and one in New York. And you'll have to pardon me. This is a verbatim quote. I'm just trying to be accurate here. But Mike Wallace, listen to these lawyers, and they're wonderful. I love lawyers. Seriously, my wife's a lawyer. I'm just kidding. But they basically were threatening, and they were putting CBS on notice 72 hours before a broadcast. And Mike listened to them, and Mike has a way of cutting through it, which is enjoyable. And So he said, let me get this straight. Aren't you basically just saying you're going to sue our ass? And these lawyers, they don't use, that's not a legal term. And they kind of backtracked a little bit, but they were essentially, they were trying to get us not to publish without suing. I mean, that is all, I call it the brushback pitch. And most of my segments at 60, I would get that kind of thing right before broadcast. But back to your question, I had a fellow who wanted to sue the Russian billionaire oligarchs and Aiken Gump for things like you just said, for frivolous litigation, for coercion, you name it. And the board of directors of the center did not want to do it for various reasons. They had been living through this for 5 years, and I think they envisioned another 5 years, and there's even more to that story. But could you, I'm personally convinced that the best strategy is the most aggressive strategy, and that is not what we employed. We basically tried to get the suit to go away. We did not go after them. When you're insured by someone, we were on the hook. The insurer still had to cover us for that Russian case, and I wanted to go real deep on discovery, particularly with one individual. You can imagine who I'm thinking of, the law firm didn't want to touch it because they felt it would take too much time, it cost too much money, and they just didn't. So the best thing is when you are insuring yourself or you're in charge of your own legal destiny, and then you can go right back at them. And I actually have come to the view that the best defense is a very strong offense, and I've come to that view, and it took a little bit of scar tissue to come to that realization, but I think that is the way to do it. I agree with that. But I'm not a professional legal defense guy, I should point out, and I don't play well on TV. Other questions? We'll get down here, don't worry.
As corporations hire lobbyists, what's the media's responsibility for the transparency of how much money goes to our elected representatives from the lobbyists?
Well, I don't know if you're referring to the media's lobbyists, but I mean, I should tell you that yeah, right. The media has a great responsibility to track that, and that's probably been the bread and butter of the Center for Public Integrity with 3 buying of the President books, the buying of the Congress book. I mean, we track the lobbying a lot, but I have to say we were the ones tracking it, the Center for Public Integrity, not most of the major news organizations. And I always said if the media was doing its job, we wouldn't need a Center for Public Integrity back before we had this current crisis. But the other thing is we have a project at the Investigative Reporting Workshop, which I had at the center, and I've moved it over with the total assent of the center, tracking media ownership in America and their lobbying. We found that in 2002 or 3, when there's a media ownership vote by the Federal Communication Commission, we had tracked 8 years of trips, that taking the media regulation officials from that agency on trips all over America, 2,500 all expense paid trips. The #1 destination, these are mostly broadcast companies, the #1 destination is that haven for media reform policy, Las Vegas. And members of Congress taken to France. One guy was taken there for 6 nights for like $25,000, and we don't know where he stayed, but we're pretty sure it was not Le Holiday Inn. And so, that's the other part that you can be sure the media does not cover. That part is about their own efforts, of course. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is the most important media-related legislation since the 1930s, with the exception of a Nightline, broadcast TV never covered it as a policy issue. It just wasn't important. And so there is an issue there. We are now going to track all those things I just said about the media, but we're also going to track broadband penetration across America. The telecom companies do not want us to know what the prices are and who doesn't have service, et cetera, et cetera. I'm determined that we're going to get that data somehow. I haven't figured it out, but we shouldn't crawl in the window at that agency or anything. But clearly, there is data. We know that the data is being gathered. The Congress ordered it be gathered, and the industry is trying to talk the Federal Communication Commission out of making it public. as we're standing here tonight. And so what gets made public is always a battle. And my goal in life is to win as many of these battles as possible. But your question's a great one. Yeah, I'll let these mic guys, you're doing a great job. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi. In your experience, I'm curious, when the media decides not to publish a story exposing a big company or corruption within public officials, which has been the major deterrent? Has it been pressure from within the media coming from above, or has it been the threat of litigation?
Well, it's hard to generalize. And I should mention, this is not a U.S. phenomenon. When I meet with journalists around the world, they'll have similar stories. And when you're a small publication, a weekly paper or a small TV, radio station in some part of any country, your advertising relationships are even more important because there aren't that many advertisers to begin with. So this is not actually even a U.S. phenomenon that we're talking about. We were talking about this at lunch today. A lot of the problem is what one journalist once called anticipatory self-restraint. It's not that the news organization is being threatened with litigation. It's that the journalists don't even bother doing the stories because they think that their publishers and editors won't do it. And I know of cases essentially where that's happened, including in my own experience. So it's more subtle. You don't have a legal threat. The ones I've just given you are covered 30 years, and I'm giving you these are big famous. Some of them are well known that I've mentioned, some I've never mentioned. But those kinds of big moments of threats they don't happen every day. Usually it's a more subtle thing. And it has to do with what you're choosing to do this week or this season on your show, or it has to do with the few resources you have you're going to devote to what subject, and you decide, and your choices, what you choose not to cover is often far more interesting than what you do choose to cover, is the way I look at it. So it's hard to answer that with a glib, quick answer. It depends on each news organization, it depends on the geography and where they are, it depends who the powers that be are in that region or that part of the world. Has to do with the reporters, whether or not they'll put up with it. Sometimes journalists reject something like this in a group and it becomes a big cause celeb. It's been known to happen. So, I mean, each case is different, so it's hard to make a generalization. Yeah.
Let me ask you about, you mentioned two stories that the news media didn't do very well on. That is the business meltdown and then the run-up to the Iraq War. Let me suggest, I got one other and that is the 9/11 Commission report itself. Both the chair of the 9/11 Commission and the vice chair, Lee Hamilton and Tom Kane, have said they got stonewalled by the CIA in that report. Recently, John Farmer, who is the dean of the Rutgers Law School, said, and I'll just read this to you, at some level of government, Farmer said, at some point in time, a decision was made not to tell the truth about the national response to the attacks on the morning of 9/11. Farmer, by the way, was a senior counsel, a lawyer on the 9/11 Commission. I've always been stunned by the fact that nobody has picked up on Lee Hamilton's and Kane's statements and on Farmer's statements about the report that we all were supposed to rely on.
Right. There was a good book by Philip Shannon, I guess? Shannon, sorry. Laying out all the flaws with the commission. The executive director had a close relationship with the Bush White House before he took the job. I mean, there was no question that there were some flaws with the way that was done. On the other hand, I have to tell you, the media has a well-known aversion to going back and reviewing the storyline 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years later. Most people don't want to do it. I mean, and I have to be honest, as a journalist, when I used to get calls in the 70s about the Kennedy assassination or someone would link the Bobby Kennedy with the John Kennedy, and also they'd throw in George Wallace and I'm not saying you're doing that, but what happens is journalists get a hard shell about this because they know they have to go back, in that case, through 1,000 past books you know, tens of thousands of pages, reconstructing it. You're talking about swimming against the Mississippi River. It's just hard as a journalist, and a news organization is reluctant to commit those resources. And there's the other thing with the internet phenomenon, which is partly what you're talking about, I think, is, you know, there are a lot of theories about what really happened, and a lot of people have weighed in on all sides of this. I think a lot of the media is not sure what to believe at this point and what to think, and the media is tagged pretty closely to officialdom. And if both houses of Congress, if both parties and various presidents don't talk about it, don't think about it, don't discuss it, and don't review it, it's very hard for an individual news organization, especially when strapped for cash, to go down that, up that river, whatever. It's very difficult. So I'm not defending it, but I get it. I actually understand that one. And I'm not saying we shouldn't know more about the 9/11 thing. I'd like to know more about everything. Unfortunately, it's an illness I have. But I don't know how I know what you're getting at here, and I'm just saying that's one where I've sort of checked that one off and I've moved on. I probably shouldn't, but you know, there's always the sanity issue you've got to worry about, and I've decided that's a way to move forward for me.
Can I suggest to you why you shouldn't check it off?
Sure.
Lee Hamilton, the 9/11 Commission, got a report on the involvement of the Pakistan ISI in 9/11. I don't know if Lee Hamilton got that report. He's told me that. They did not have anything in the report about the ISI, that is Pakistan's intelligence service. And we now are fighting a war in Afghanistan and Pakistan where supposedly the ISI is our ally. I mean, that report says they're just the opposite. That quote, and it's a quote from the report, that they were fully involved in 9/11.
Right. No, I hear you, and anyway, we can talk later about it. There's a lot of other evidence that Pakistan has serious issues with their factions and things like that, and it's an abundance of evidence that the 9/11 Commission was stonewalled by the Bush administration in a number of ways. So I'm not excusing any of that. I'm just saying, you're asking why the media didn't pursue it. It's a very, very large subject. Now it feels, after the fact, to a lot of journalists, and they've moved on, and maybe that's not a good thing, but that's reality. And then I try to stay in that realm to the extent I can. Other questions?
I've been lucky to do a lot of international traveling, and I was in India right before the first Gulf War, and I've just noticed. I mean, it was interesting for you to talk about. We have these press freedoms, and other people in the world don't have them and live under danger. But I noticed that in India, I thought they had a much freer press than we have in the U.S., even though they probably don't have the same kind of legal guarantees. And it was very interesting being in India before the first Gulf War and reading a report that the Saudi government made a contribution to the Gorbachev government right before the UN vote for $6 billion. And later a Russian diplomat told me that he couldn't be quoted, but it was 16 billion. Now that was an interesting story, and I've told that to people. I've never read that in any press thing. And then I've also been in Israel a couple times. And there's a more honest discussion in Israel about the relationship between U.S. and Israel than there is in the U.S. between Israel and the U.S. I mean, a more of a give and take discussion.
Well, no, I mean, boy, this is very interesting. I've been to India. I don't know. It's hard to measure their level of press freedom in relation to the U.S. We know that the press is exploding there, that they are creating new news organizations, and it's the opposite of what's happening here, and there's expanding media organizations, including Reuters and AP, have moved into India in the last few years. Regarding Saudi Arabia, I think we're going to hear a lot more about Saudi Arabia in the next 6 to 12 months, and that will actually overshadow what you just said in terms of magnitude and dimension. The relations between all these countries and what they're doing are incredibly enthralling, actually. And the best coverage about Israel, I think, is actually in Europe. There was a Harvard study a few years ago looking at an incident involving Israel and its neighbors, and they studied media from like 10 countries, including the U.S., and they concluded in this particular instance that the German media was the most quote-unquote objective. It didn't go in with any baggage about any one country, and it kind of clinically laid out the facts. And that's a really interesting subject, just from a media studies standpoint, is how various countries cover international subject. A lot of Americans during the lead up to the Iraq War and during the Iraq War after March 2003 actually got their news from Europe, from various broadcasts that they could get in the U.S. either via the web or otherwise. So there's a lesson there, which I think you're getting at in part, that you need a lot of sources just like a reporter does, and what is quote unquote objective, or what level of quality of reporting and detachment that journalists bring varies, not just between journalist to journalist and organization to organization, but country to country. And it's a really fascinating thing you've raised, and it's a long one. I'll stop. But thank you. Other questions? Sorry. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about nonprofit journalism and sort of with the crisis that journalism is going through right now. Do you think that that would be a feasible or even sustainable option for large-scale media? Do you think it functions better on the small scale, or if it's even more ethical in the long run?
That's a great question, and I should have said more about this during the talk, so thanks for the question. The Institute for Interactive Journalism did a study in June. 180 foundations gave $128 million for journalism and news initiatives since 2005. I was always told by my board at the Center for Public Integrity that we did not have a sustainable business model, and I said, yes, but I've been doing it now for 10 or 15 years, and now it's been going for 20 years. And so when I did my paper at Harvard, A Growing Importance of Nonprofit Journalism, 17,000 words, and I profiled 4 nonprofits on 3 continents, Alex Jones, the very able director of that program, said, well, you shouldn't compare these investigative centers with Associated Press and NPR. Those are national institutions. And I said, Alex, AP's been around since 1846. They started with 4 newspapers. NPR's been around 40 years. These others are fairly new, so who's to say they're not going to become institutions? And I could make a fairly good case that a couple of these already are institutions. So it's hard to estimate the trajectory, and I would never suggest that nonprofit journalism can replace or supplement. It can definitely supplement, but can it replace or supplant what we have known as the commercial major media that's so large and so immense, at least historically it has been, that I'm not suggesting that. On the other hand, if you have a few hundred reporters nationwide who are devoted to watchdog journalism in their local communities and at the national level, you know what, in a couple of years, I bet you the number of people doing it in the nonprofit realm will equal the number of folks who did it at I-teams at some of these places. They're starting to become similar numbers. The question is the sustainability. I think that we don't know the answer to that question. We don't know if for-profit can work anymore with journalism, honestly. We don't know. What you're seeing is a morphing. You're seeing for-profits taking contributions from citizens, which is a very unusual idea. It's unheard of a few years ago. We now have nonprofits doing advertising, and so what you're seeing is experimentation going on here, and there's going to be hybrid things that come up that resemble either one or the other or both. And there's actually an L3C corporation that's been proposed is now in 6 or 8 states that is a for-profit nonprofit in one corporation, and so. I think what we should all do is keep watching this. We're seeing an ecosystem sprout up that no one thought was ever going to happen in this country, and it's directly relating to the carnage at the commercial media newsrooms. And so How long will that carnage last? We don't know. How many more nonprofits will we see in the next 1, 2, 3 years? We don't know. Do I think we're going to see a lot more nonprofits and a lot of growth and a lot more money spent for the foreseeable future? The answer is yes. Is that a global phenomenon? Yes. Do I think that, I think most of the most important investigative reporting of our time is increasingly going to be done by nonprofits. I could even make a case it's been happening for years and no one noticed. But that would be self-serving, so I would never say that. Other questions? Yeah.
I guess this is kind of a related question, but with all the rise of these nonprofits and bloggers, citizen journalism, all of that, do you see perhaps a temptation on behalf of the mainstream media to sort of leave the kind of hard-hitting investigative reporting to those people who may have less to lose and less contributors to worry about?
It's really an interesting question. I think there's certainly that temptation. They didn't need much temptation. A lot of them had no compunction with the guillotine on their I-teams, irrespective of what the nonprofits did. What is happening now is really very interesting. The major media outlets don't have enough staff. They've gutted their newsrooms. They have one reporter now doing the job of 3 or 4 people. So it's because of the cuts. So they need content that's different than balloons, and then we've got nonprofits that have websites that want more traffic and more reach and impact than just their website. So you have a marriage of convenience here. You'll notice that ProPublica, the Center for Public Integrity, the Investigative Reporting Workshop, Center for Investigative Reporting, the big 4 national groups that now Associated Press is including to its clients nationwide, first time since 1846 that they've included nonprofits in their content. The Pulitzer Prizes opened up in December 8th last year, first time they allowed the potential for a nonprofit to win a Pulitzer. For online news publishers, that would include nonprofits. So that the ground is shifting in the conventions of media as we've known it in this country. And there are convenient alliances that are setting up. So ProPublica and these other groups, including the workshop, we have our next projects coming out with McClatchy. The one after that's coming out with Financial Times. We're doing a partnership co-production with Frontline coming out in February. We're going to be a co-production hub with Frontline. And so that's good for Frontline, it's good for the workshop. And there's now 10 universities with investigative reporting centers that are using the great talents and energies of young people. So this is not hieroglyphics, and it lives on. And blending it in with the infrastructure that's on those campuses with the major media that has been eviscerated. And actually right now it's pretty cool because it's working. I mean, it's working meaning the stories are getting out and they're getting large audience. And does that help a nonprofit raise money if it's been seen by tens of millions of people? Of course it does. So everybody wins there for now. Does that mean it's permanent? No, I would never say that. Who knows? So stay tuned on that. Other questions? Yeah, sorry.
Can you share your thoughts on the responsibility of the American citizen to pay more attention to investigative reporting as opposed to late night TV and what Britney Spears is doing and all the other fluff shows that seem to be more entertainment than what I would characterize as news?
That's a wonderful question. Look, I have to be honest, I try really hard not to get mad. Obviously, I need to work on that. But I do get very frustrated when 2/3 of the American people think Saddam brought down the trade towers at the end of '04 after it's been established there were no weapons of mass destruction. You're getting at really the issue of engagement by the citizens themselves. I mean, if you don't have an informed citizenry, you don't have citizens who even are knowledgeable, who care. I remember back in '96 there was a poll that 40% of the American people could not name the vice president of the United States. Now and then 80 or 90% didn't know the names of the member of Congress. That is disgusting. I mean, there is an obligation as a citizen, and we are essentially, we are prisoners of our own mythology. We are still living in the Norman Rockwell 1950s, Pax Americana, where we believe that we are the greatest nation on earth in every single category, even though we've slipped below number 10 in a lot of the categories: prenatal care, living standards, roads and bridges and their condition, internet access. I mean, a lot of those things the United States has substantially slipped in recent years, and the rest of the world has noticed. Most Americans are clueless, I think, about. Well, I'm not talking about this. Most people don't come out on a rainy night you're not. Yeah. Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Anyway, I hear what you're saying, and I share the view, the country deserves better. And you know, the old cliche, democracy is not a spectator sport. That's the issue, and that has to change. We have challenges in this country that are no longer just within our borders. They affect the whole world, and we have got to start engaging in these issues. And if we don't, it's at our peril, and that's what worries me. And a lot of the journalism is not still focusing. It's still looking down and not looking into those larger issues. And the reason I've been doing all this international reporting stuff since the late 90s is I realized so many of these subjects are in totally global subjects. Every subject we're going to start doing now is increasingly going to have a global factor to it. A few years ago, only 15 or 20% of the American people had passports. Okay? We could talk for a long time on this question. I'll stop. Thanks. Other questions?
I have a sort of a tactical question.
Sure.
You talked about putting out the banking reports from the FDIC, and the Internet has provided a lot of ways to get information out. I'm curious as to your comments on how the Internet has changed your research methodology and any differences between the U.S. and other parts of the world in terms of how the Internet has changed, if it has, sources and methods.
Oh, that's a great question. You know, the first years of the Center for Public Integrity, starting in the first study was in December of '90. From that period up till the Buying of the President '96 book, we didn't use the Internet. I mean, it wasn't really available, or at least we had not embraced it. And so we would just do hundreds of reports and pass them out to the press club or something, and it was very modest. But then when we had the Patriot II Act that the administration said didn't exist, that was suddenly a fairly, oh my gosh, I'm holding this document, it could be introduced in the Senate tomorrow morning. And we put it on, we were told not to do it by the Attorney General, that would be, his top aide said we'd be sorry if we published it, and we asked them to spell their name, and we put it up, and it moved around the world, 350,000 unique visitors in 5 days, 100 groups connected to the center site within 20 minutes. The viral thing went crazy, 15 million hits, and 100 news stories in the U.S. alone. And I could tell you international stories we've done where inside 72 hours, it's a story of literally the entire world, and there's criminal prosecutions launched within hours. That's the Internet. Now you can do an investigative story, and it can actually be a global investigative story. If you study the history of muckraking, it was always about your community or your little newsletter or your publication. So that gets to the reach question. You're talking about sources and methods. One of the things we did in the mid to late 90s, it got better with each year, so I'm spreading it out. It wasn't enough to link to an amazing document. Like if we did the business of war with 90 private military companies and we had 10 journalists in 6 continents, that's great, and we could link to really cool secret documents. That's fun. But what was really great is when we put up 7,400 financial disclosures for every state legislator in America, which no one had ever done, and suddenly you're looking at conflicts of interest in 50 state legislatures, and the public could read the disclosure forms. Or we put up the 527 independent groups that are so mischievous at election time. So we put up their funding sources from IRS records for both Move On and SwiftBoat and all these groups. And all the citizens could just type it in and get the stuff. That is really exciting. Then the public is using the data, it's searchable, and then you can do it across borders, which we've done around the world with various subjects. And so what it has done is it's made data more interesting and more accessible than it used to be. Now it's not just, a little sheaf of papers and I'm going to tell you what I saw. That's the way it used to be done. Now the public can see it themselves. The other part of that is sources and methods is the public. The engaged public can, the citizen journalism phenomenon. That is not something the center or the workshop has done enough on, but we did do a book at the center called Citizen Muckraking in 2000. And clearly the public, with the Public Insight Project here at Minnesota Public Radio with 75 to 90,000 citizens in the region, helping out with the coverage, that's really interesting. So we haven't gotten into that quite yet, but I've seen investigative stories that I'm terribly impressed with that could not have been done without citizens. And I just want to do more of that myself. But it is changing. It's really more of the public impact more than the sources and methods. Did we always check those documents? Actually, we did. That says something about us, I guess, anal retentive, et cetera. But I think that it's going to keep changing. Now there's hypertext analysis that's going beyond computer-assisted reporting. Now there's satellite imagery being used overseas to see things like you can actually see drought by looking down at Africa, and you can predict where the migrations are going to occur from the drought pictures. I mean, stuff like that journalists can do, not just intelligence agencies. You can see a spill off the coast of Japan that's killing millions of fish, and you can actually see it with satellite imagery now, and you can start to cover that as journalists. That is thrilling stuff. I mean, the technology and the ability to use this and integrate it with other info sources. My favorite thing is to take 6 or 8 of these and blend them into one narrative and tell you the whole story and use all these tools. I mean, that is heady stuff. It doesn't happen every day. But when it does, it's spectacular. So I find that really kind of exciting. Other questions? Yeah.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak with us tonight.
Sure.
A lot of us here are law students, and I guess my question would be, I've heard you talk a lot about how lawyers have had a very negative impact on investigative journalism. If we wanted to have a positive impact, there are a lot of easy steps we could take to sort of diminish the profession, defending these large corporations, taking jobs at enormous law firms that contribute to this. Sort of what hands-on steps can we take in the short term and long term to sort of ensure the safety of investigative journalism?
Great question. I'm going to come around the bend here. I'll get to the question, I promise. But I want to just tell you, I wasn't kidding. My wife is a lawyer. She was a public interest lawyer, and she sues major corporations, and she ran the Consumer Product Safety Commission in the 90s. We forget that Gandhi, Lincoln, and Robert Kennedy were all lawyers. I mean, there's lawyers and there's lawyers. There's different things lawyers can do. There are exciting things that can be done to help journalists. I'll give you an example. Right now, as Jane knows, in Britain, a group of public interest lawyers have created the first nonprofit to help journalists fight libel all over the world. They're trying to stitch together a network of pro bono lawyers, literally on every continent, that will help those journalists not go to prison and also not lose all their assets. That's an innovation. That has not happened before. That's brand new. That happened last year. That started in 2008. Now, that's an example of what can be done. There is a media defense, I guess it's a media, the group in New York that gives out entrepreneurial grants. They've given away, I think lawyers started it, but it doesn't use the law that much, but they basically have given out $100 million in loans to new startup media entities around the world. And now those are new nonprofit constructs. That requires an attorney to create that. But I mean, there are these kinds of things. Freedom of information. When we sued the Army and the State Department, we got all the Iraq contracts, and we got the Halliburton contract declassified. I had a lawyer on my staff working at the center. The guy went to Harvard. He could have worked anywhere he wanted, but he believed in the center, and he's still at the staff level. And we had other pro bono lawyers helping with freedom of information. There are many of those kinds of things that can be done. There's a lot more that has to be done. I mean, the information, why do we just have information about the Securities and Exchange Commission? Why don't we have the Frankfurt Exchange and the London Exchange and the Hong Kong Exchange, all the delisting information? That should all be in one place. Does that involve lawyers? Yeah, probably, getting all that information. As the web matures, and as we keep moving down this information track, getting access to that is going to be increasingly difficult. It's going to be proprietary, and this whole open source versus proprietary information thing, particularly if it's government records, will raise its ugly head. And so those are things that lawyers are desperately needed to cut through the thicket, to be there in strength. And I know a number of lawyers who have entered the legal profession professionally after leaving law school, who are trying to do these kinds of specific things. And that's just with the media. There's a lot of other really great, cool stuff that can be done. So I wish you well, and there's a lot of work to be done. Other questions? Yeah, or up here, and then we can come down. Thanks.
My question is this. I have had the opportunity to travel a lot for different reasons, being in the travel business. And I also have the background major of anthropology, so I look at things a little bit differently. I try to be open-minded, as many folks in this room are. My question is this. I like what you said about Abraham Lincoln bringing the facts to the people. And when I read the paper over and over again, and they keep referring to a nuclear Iran, the word nuclear, I'm not sure what they're using their nuclear powers for. I have no contact with them. I've lived there, but they're not personally calling me and telling me anything, though they could. My question is, if we keep saying nuclear and creating fear in the people, and the people Americans feel unsafe, or feel that this country is going to really go to war with someone and maybe not using the nuclear power because their lights go out or their air conditioning go off in the heat of the summer, isn't that raising a risk communication to a point that we don't need to? Here we go with the red and the orange and the yellow, the Dick Cheney stuff. And what responsibility does journalists have and the media have to make sure that we are creating knowledge for the people, but not putting them to the point that we're worrying about another country and not really understanding other parts of that country? Their culture, the people, the history. We're not getting balance. Thank you.
Sure. It's a complex question because, as you know, different countries in the region itself around Iran have very strong views about what Iran's doing. The International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna has different views, but they change year to year about what Iran is doing. And we have a different administration that has opened up a dialogue with Iran, which is a first compared to recent years, but there's also been evidence or information that's come out that is discordant with that new feeling of things are going to be fine there. This is really a larger issue about nuclear nonproliferation, and we basically have a checkered record here. We have not acknowledged that certain countries have weapons still, even though it's been known in the world for 30 or 40 years. And we decide who can or should have them. It's obviously desperately important for the world that there be as few as possible. No one disputes that. But the U.S. has a checkered past about its credibility on these points. And the media is forced, it's unfortunate, but the media generally doesn't have the expertise. They listen to intelligence agencies and Department of Defense employees and others, and they're become prisoners to the various factions that have agendas. And you can just read Cy Hirsch's wonderful work in The New Yorker over the last 5 years. There are hawkish folks inside the government who are legitimate officials, and they very strongly are desperately worried and use the N-word all the time. And then there's others who think it's overblown. And the problem with the federal government with 2 or 3 million people and 114 federal agencies is that journalists are going to quote different ones, different days, different organizations, and different circumstances. And so it's really hard to generalize. Does the media have a responsibility to get it right? They do. The problem with this story is it keeps moving, same as the North Korea story keeps moving. So it's hard to even make a general statement about it because what's true today may not be true next week. So your point's well taken. Unfortunately, these issues aren't going to go away, and there will be the kinds of things you're frustrated by will keep happening because of the nature of how information evolves in our society. It's not going to change, unfortunately. Sorry. Whatever you want.
One more question, and then
Okay.
we have to wrap it up.
Sure.
Just maybe a quick question is, you've noted a lot of dynamics within the industry currently between empowering journalists, individual journalists, the internet phenomena, but also questions of professionalism and individual interests is, where do you see possibly these self-policing techniques really being handled responsibly in addition to individuals or corporations that are really being prophetic in the business? And where is it there models that we can start to look to as we go forward the next few years?
When you say self-policing, you're talking about journalists or the corporations or who?
Both. What the relationship between both are, how that interplays between the two entities.
No, that's a great question. These are all so complex to answer because, some corporations are, I hate to use these words, but they are proactive. They actually have lawyers who train them in ethics and how to respond and how not to respond, and other companies don't. News organizations, there have been 300 lawsuits against bloggers in the last 14, 15 years, and now some bloggers are starting to realize they maybe should have standards about how they comport themselves with information and how it should be treated. Standards are always going to vary from company to company and from individual to individual, regardless of all the things we talk about here. I think the one interesting element of the web is the dynamic quality of it, how fast it's moving, how much it changes, and how everyone sees it, how it can flash up at any time. I mean, that has clearly radically changed all of our lives in this room. Exactly what effect it's having on standards. It's hard to see that we have any standards most days. And so I haven't had a chance to think deeply about what you just asked. I think it's a really interesting question. The journalism world has always prided itself, and Jane will cringe, in not having any standards. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, compared to doctors and lawyers, there's certain institutions like the Society of Professional Journalists and others, they have codes of ethics, but there's not a professional test, your bar exam or other kinds of standards for that, and each country varies, and no journalist wants the government to do that, for God's sake. I mean, so you have self-policing, and in many cases that has frankly not worked all that well with a lot of news organizations. So that's just within the realm of the media. This is a complex, difficult matter you've raised. So I don't know the answer. I think my feeling is everyone has to be responsible for what they do. And the nonprofits, they have to disclose who their donors are. They have to try to the extent possible, have a wall between the folks that give money and the folks who are doing the work. They need to tell you who's working there, what their background is. They should post the IRS 990 forms so we know how much their salaries are and where they work and how big their budget was. And I think if nonprofits adhere to those standards, and then if the corporate media starts revealing how much honoraria their reporters are getting when they give speeches to companies, which most of them still don't do, and when Supreme Court justices tell us more about those trips they took, et cetera. I mean, there is actually a disclosure form, but no one reads that. But all I'm saying is, can we have better standards in all these areas? The answer is yes. It's always case by case, and all we can do is keep trying to move the ball down the field here. So anyway, thanks. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Chuck for spending his time. I feel like anything I would say would be superfluous, so I'm just going to say that there are refreshments outside. We hope you will join us for conversation, and we hope you'll join us at our next Silha lecture, which will be our 25th annual sometime next fall. Thank you. Now you're going to
That's a little windy there, sorry.